In 1883, the pioneering British archaeologist and Egyptologist Flinders Petrie started excavation work on a mound on the western Canopic branch of the Nile Delta. Flinders began his search for the remains of a Greek settlement in late 1883 after buying a small alabaster statuette from a market dealer in Giza and noting something rather particular about the figure, which he would write about to fellow archaeologist Reginald Stuart Pole in a letter written on the 1st of December. I went to Giza one day to see what things I might want that were still there from my old store, and also to hear anything that I could of antiquities. I succeeded in obtaining what I hoped to be a prize for the British Museum, and I hope to send you a photo as soon as I can get it done. By the style of it, it seems distinctly early Greek. After hearing about similar statuettes seemingly originating from the same place, Petrie pinpointed all of the antiquities to the village of An-Nibaira, approximately 72 kilometers from Alexandria and roughly 110 kilometers from where he initially purchased the statuette in Giza. Once he arrived in An-Nibaira, he paid the locals to show him the source of all the antiquities, and the locals pointed him towards a mound, or rather a tell overlooking the town. A letter sent to Pole by Petrie dating from the 21st of January 1884 detailed the splendidness of which the site after discovering a vast quantity of imported Greek goods, suggesting that the site must have been quite prosperous, although by this point Flinders still didn't know the identity of the site. Next morning, I went down to the Pasha's house to see if anything was heard of the manager. Only saw 3 men, who were very polite, who said that he would come today, but one of them pointed out a stone which I had looked at before, but had not seen a lightly cut inscription which faced a wall. I almost jumped as I read, "So, this is Naukratis." Petrie had finally discovered the identity of the site, and it was with the ancient Greek trading city of Naukratis. And after continuing to dig on the site, he discovered that the ancient city had a history much older than anyone knew. Not only was the city ancient, but it also served as a crucial link to the history of interconnectivity of the ancient Mediterranean, and its long history, as well as its unique and special status in Egypt of the past, makes the city a wonder to behold. According to the Wikipedia of the ancient world, Herodotus, the city of Naukratis' founding dated back to 570 BC, following the ascension of the usurper pharaoh Ahmose II after defeating the previous pharaoh, Apries. Apries, or as he was known in his native Egyptian tongue, Vahibre Haibre, was the pharaoh of Egypt between 589 and 570 BC. He was known among his subjects as being a serious Hellenophile, as a certain amphora displays. The amphora in question was found in Naukratis by none other than Flinders Petrie himself, and it dates from around 570 to 550 BC, after the reign of Apries. The vase originated from Ionia, and it features a plethora of different signs of its Greek origin, such as a Corinthian helmet featured on a boxer, and an Ionian column standing proudly behind him. What makes this vase special is the hieroglyphs near the top of the vase, which spell out Apries' name. This shows that, despite possibly being made after the reign of Apries, the admiration for him and his reign were still being sung in the Greek communities of Egypt and the rest of the Greek world. This admiration of the Greeks over his native subjects caused an Egyptian general by the name of Ahmose, fueled by an anti-Hellenic pro-Egyptian fervor shared among his men, to openly rebel against the Hellenophile king. The revolt started following a failed Egyptian military expedition to the Greek kingdom of Cyrene to the east. This caused the Egyptian army to mutiny, as they suspected that Apries had betrayed them in order to rule more absolutely via his army of Greek mercenaries. To quell this mutiny, Apries sent the general Ahmose to to deal with the mutineers, but to Apries' surprise, Ahmose sympathized with the disloyal army and was proclaimed pharaoh by them. After this, Apries had to entirely rely on his Greek mercenaries to fight, and despite his best efforts, Apries was captured by Ahmose, who was later proclaimed as Pharaoh Ahmose II. Despite revolting against Apries for his Hellenophilia, Ahmose understood the importance of having the Greeks satisfied and the Greeks' mercenaries still loyal toward of the Assyrian and later Achaemenid Persian threat to the east. So following his defeat of Apries, Ahmose decided to limit but also to centralize the Greco-Egyptian trade. He did so first of all by restricting the Greek trade to only the Canopic, or in other words, the western branch of the Nile Delta. Greeks were still allowed to freely travel the country, but all merchant activities were to be restricted to a single location. Ahmose also decided to settle the Greek mercenaries of Apries' army into a new home and to help the new expansion of the Greek trade to the Canopic branch. He decided to choose the site that would become the city of Naukratis for the settling Greek mercenaries. This story told by Herodotus, however, is only a half-truth, as these events don't mark the initial foundation of Naukratis, but instead its resurgence following the events of Ahmose's rise to power. The site that would later on become the city of Naukratis was originally founded as a Milesian trading station, or emporium, by the name of Milesian Tychos in the 7th century BC, with evidence suggesting that it existed by the time of Pharaoh Psamtik I of the 26th dynasty of Egypt. The emporium was founded in a rather close proximity to the then capital of Egypt, Sais, with the distance between the two sites only being around 18 kilometers. The creation of Milesian Tychos was a sign of the widespread and rapid expansion of the archaic age of Greek history, and the emporium signified a new age of trade between the Greek world and Egypt. The creation of the Milesian fort was, however, not the beginning, but instead the resurrection of a much longer tradition of Greco-Egyptian trade. Trade between the Greeks and the Egyptians had existed since the dawn of Greek civilization, when the Minoans used to take a direct route between Crete and Egypt for trade. This can be seen throughout the various jars, glassware and other common trading goods that have been found in various Egyptian Greek sites and shipwrecks. Another thing to mention is that the Egyptian unit of weight, the chet, measured about 100 cubits, was widely used in Crete. The trade extends past just the trade in goods, as several works of Minoan art have been found throughout all of Egypt, such as a Minoan-style fresco found in the Tel el-Daba'a palace in what was then Avaris, and several appearances of Minoans in the art of Theban graves. Despite the temporary setbacks following Hyksos' invasion of Egypt, the Greco-Egyptian trade went relatively strong, with continuing imports from both sides. Things would turn for the worst, however, as the trade networks grinded to a halt during the Bronze Age collapse and the subsequent Greek Dark Age. For a period of about 400 years, the trade routes and connections made between the Greeks and Egyptians were gone, as the major population centers of the Greek world were either heavily depopulated or fully abandoned. During the mid to tail end of the 8th century BC, however, the Greek world saw a major re-emergence, with cities once again being populated and creating the first city-states. This period of time would later be known as the Archaic Age of Greece, and it would last roughly between the end of the Greek Dark Age all the way to the Second Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC. During this time, the newly established Greek city-states would start to trade with outside powers, with one of these being the Egyptians. The various new Greek polities, such as Athens, Corinth, Miletus, and so on, would regularly trade with the Egyptians. The Egyptians' most common export was wheat, as it grew in abundance in and around the Nile River, while the Greeks often traded with hoards of silver and electrum, which either came in vast quantities of locally minted drachmae coins or bullion, with these metals mostly coming from the Thraco-Macedonia regions and Anatolia, with the tribes of the areas giving the city-states metal in exchange for goods like cloth. As a result of this newly booming trade, around 750 BC, the people of the Ionian city of Miletus, the Milesians, started to expand their trade routes to Egypt, and to facilitate this newly established trade, they established Milesian Tychos on the western Nile Delta, as stated previously. Milesian Tychos wasn't a full-fledged colony, but instead a trading outpost or emporium, which facilitated trade between the Greeks and the Egyptians. The site, even in its early days, showed a great amount of prosperity, with the semi-permanent wattle and daub houses of the earlier years being replaced by more permanent structures and temples, such as the Temple of Aphrodite during the 7th century BC, as the city received a great influx of traders and mercenaries from Anatolia. Following the Assyrian conquest of Egypt in 673 BC, the Greek merchants of Egypt would start to organize the trade in their favor, and the trade continued to grow. Psamtik I, the vassal pharaoh of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, declared independence from the Assyrians and entrusted the help of the Greek mercenaries to fight off his Assyrian overlords. Psamtik assigned the help of the Greek mercenaries after following the advice given to him by the Oracle of Vajet in the city of Buto, which advised him to use the help of, quote, men of bronze, as Greek mercenaries were called, who would arrive from the sea. This coincided with the arrival of Greek mercenaries, most likely sent by King Gyges of Lydia to Egypt, with which Psamtik would help drive out the Neo-Assyrian Empire. After about 10 years, the Assyrians were successfully driven out of Egypt, and Psamtik I continued to employ Greek mercenaries to defend the eastern frontier of Egypt from another possible Assyrian invasion, starting the reliance of Greek mercenaries by a long line of Hellenophile pharaohs all the way to the overthrowing of Apis by Ahmose. As stated previously, despite Ahmose's anti-Hellenic rise to power, he had to make sure to find a compromise between the native Egyptians and the Greeks, as the Greek mercenaries would be a tremendous help in warding off against any possible future aggressions from the east, so he concentrated the Greek trade to the Canopic Nile branch and made Naukratis the only Greek center of trade in Egypt. This compromise worked well for both the Egyptians and Greeks, as the Greeks were now limited in what they could do around Egypt at the same time as being able to concentrate and strengthen their interest. The city, becoming the only center of Greek culture and trade in Egypt, quickly grew in both population and prosperity, although this wouldn't last that long. During the reign of Ahmose's son and successor, Psamtik III, Egypt would be embroiled in a war of conquest against the Persians under the rule of Cambyses II, who sought to conquer it. At the Battle of Pelusium, the Persian army would decisively defeat the Egyptian army, subsequently causing Cambyses II to be crowned the new pharaoh of Egypt after his conquest of the Egyptian capital at Memphis. This caused the trade link between Egypt and Greece to be cut, and Naukratis started to fade in relevance. Despite this, Naukratis managed to persevere all the way to the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great, at which point it once again became a Greek center of trade. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and incorporated it into his Macedonian Empire, with his Egyptian possessions later becoming a part of the successor state of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Trade between Egypt and the Greek world once again resumed, and the new Greek rulers of Egypt would naturally be more lenient and fair towards the Greek settlers of Naukratis, and the Naukratis became one of the new centers of Greek culture in the region. All wasn't good for Naukratis, however, as Naukratis' importance as the only center of Greek trade was ironically diminished by the introduction of new Greek settlers, who preferred other, newer centers of Greek culture created by the Ptolemaic rulers, with the two most notable being the town of Ptolemais Hermio and, most importantly, Alexandria. Alongside those two, Naukratis became one of the places where newly arrived Greek settlers could register as citizens. although the other two centers became much preferred over Naukratis, and it didn't do a lot to slow down the decline of the city. Naukratis would, however, become important for the Alexandrians, as the Canopic Canal which the city laid on allowed for easy transportation between the city and Alexandria, with grain transports carrying tens of tons of grain to Alexandria continuing well into the early Byzantine period. Following the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, Naukratis and Egypt as a whole started to trade more with the rest of the Roman Empire. Naukratis would continue its importance as a stop for the Alexandrian grain trade, and the city started to export Egyptian wares and import Roman ones, most commonly amphorae. The integration into the Roman market can be especially seen with a hoard of Roman coins and jewelry found in the southwestern part of the town by Sir Flinders Petrie himself. The city did see a small increase during the early Egyptian-Roman period, up to the early 2nd century AD, as settlements and industry continued to grow in the area. This growth would, however, be abruptly cut as a series of disasters and conflicts caused the site to quickly reduce in size. The first of these events was the Antonine Plague between 165 and 166 AD, which devastated the Roman Empire, with one of the hardest hit regions being Egypt. The plague became endemic to Egypt and it continued well into the 170s, resulting in around 20% of the population of Egypt succumbing to the plague, hitting Egypt's agriculture sector particularly hard. The city wouldn't have much time to recover, as between 193 and 197, Rome fell into civil war after 5 men declared themselves emperors of Rome. Although stability would come in the region during the rule of the Severan dynasty, Naukratis wouldn't see too much recovery, but instead shrink further following bad crop harvests, economic downturn in the region, and an increase in taxation starting in the mid-3rd century AD. Following Diocletian's reform of the late 3rd and early 4th century, and the lowering of taxes in around the same time, Naukratis would start to once again resurge in importance, wealth and population. Although the city would see some conflict during the transition of the Roman Empire from pagans to Christians, the city did continue to thrive, mostly unharmed. Following the split of the empire in 395, following the death of Theodosius I, the empire split into halves, with Naukratis falling within the Eastern Roman Empire. Naukratis continued to export grain to Alexandria, which itself witnessed a growth in trade. Egypt as a whole increased the production of textiles and wine between the 4th and 6th centuries, and the site of Naukratis would survive the Justinian plague of 541 to 542 much better than the earlier Antonine plague. Naukratis wasn't to be forever, however, as the site saw a sharp decline during the mid to late 7th century, following the 642 Rashidun conquest of Egypt, with no Islamic-era pottery being found at the site. This can be attributed to the fact that the Canopic Canal, which Naukratis relied on, dried up. Canals were quite expensive and draining to maintain, and the Rashidun Caliphate saw little reason to maintain the canal, with the Egyptian grain trade instead being redirected through the Red Sea Canal to the Arabian Peninsula instead of the Mediterranean. Alexandria would continue as an important Islamic center, although Naukratis quickly fell into irrelevance, with the site being abandoned by the end of the 7th century. Seldom remembered today by most people, Naukratis has nevertheless shown itself as a very valuable and important site for the ancient Mediterranean. The site offers an interesting insight into the trade and relationship between the ancient Greeks and Egyptians, as well as Egypt's trade with the rest of the Mediterranean in the latter half of antiquity to a lesser extent. Although the city never became one of the great cities of the Mediterranean, nor did it survive well into the Middle Ages, the insight which it has given historians and archaeologists, started with Sir Flinders Petrie, into ancient Egypt and Greece is invaluable, and the city can certainly be commended for that.